We're excited to be talking with you all about place-based games for social impact. And one of the reasons that I'm really excited is that I think that local games are a big future of games for change. And in some ways, when I say the future is local for games, I'm not just talking about location-based in terms of GPS. In fact, all of us are going to be talking about place. And I think if there's one thing that I want all of us to evangelize out there, it's that GPS is not the same as place. That the neighborhoods we live in, it's not just that it starts at a certain longitude and ends at another longitude. Those boundaries not only shift, but are established and built by all of us. And the opportunity for us to shape our communities and places, to bring history from the past, and to figure out where we want to go as a community is something that games are increasingly playing a role in. So I wanted to remind us that play in local places is not just digital. In fact, there have been artist projects and citizen projects, government projects that go back hundreds of years. Really, sometimes they involve play culture. Like here is a giant inflated piece moving through the streets of Minneapolis, St. Paul in a fantastic game that I recommend folks learning a little about the Big Urban Game if you've never heard about it. It's a great project. But also, the digital is changing things. The places where the digital is appearing in our cities and our places is growing and changing. And that's one of the reasons why I say that the future with play is really interesting at the local level. These kinds of interfaces and screens are going to appear. And of course, we have mobile phones. But I think that if anything, we think too much in terms of the mobile device as the consumption of media objects, as opposed to play that is tied to places, that is situated in places. And I think all of our projects touch on that importance of where is the game and how is it connected to place, not just distributed to mobile devices. Part of the reason I'm excited about this is I put out a book during the pandemic called Locally Played. I have to do thank you. Read the book if you want to hear about how playful tactics can make for stronger places. How can we strengthen our neighborhoods and communities? And it goes through a couple of case studies. What we're going to do today as a panel is give you a taste of a couple different place-based game projects and hope to whet your appetite to come and talk with us at the end of the day. We're doing a networking session, in fact, 2 of them, so there's 2 different times you could come, see more of the games or projects in action, or just talk with us about some of these topics. So we're hoping this is the start of a conversation. So to kick that off, let's turn it to Stephen.
Thank you very much. I'll take the clicker. So I'm Stephen. I'm from Australia. It took me a while to get here. But it's lovely to be here, and I have to thank everyone for having me. I created Streets of My Town, and Streets of My Town is a platform that you can use to create your social impact game for your local community. So in Streets of My Town, we actually recreate a small local area in a game. It's a 2.5D game. That's really narrative-based and story-driven. So we've got a little trailer, so it's probably easier explained.
Yeah, I block every day. Now we in the game like EA. Said that it ain't that easy. But we keeping it 100 like a freeway. Don't need a tick, just do it. You know that you're linking with the moment. Say what they want, see how they feel. We gon' let it slide, move on up, cut us Mayfield. On the right, we can't get enough. You know that I'm hollering love. And I know it get tough, so let me hear you holler. On the right, and we can't get enough. You know that I'm hollering love. And I know it get tough, so let me hear you holler. I'm hollering love. Let me hear you holler.
So yeah, Streets of My Town. In Streets of My Town, we recreate the local place. And usually it'll be a not-for-profit who approaches us, or a small local government, and they want to use Streets of My Town to achieve a specific outcome. And that's where we start. We always start with a local organisation, and we talk about what they want to achieve. So it could be a local mental health service that has a new program for local young people, and then they want to use Streets of My Town to explain about the mental health issue, and then engage young people to use these services or use these programs. And so once we have those outcomes that the organisation wants to achieve, we put together a creative team. And the creative team always exists of people with either a lived experience or a close experience with the issue that we're trying to resolve in Streets of My Town. And we also draw up the local services or local buildings. And we do that so the player who plays Streets of My Town immediately recognises that this is a game about their place. This is not just a random global game, this is about their community. And it's really interesting what we actually see then, because players, like in this case the Bunurong Aboriginal Health Services, players will walk past this building and they will click on it. They will try and find out more information about it. And how different is that to the real world? When you walk past a service like this, people don't go in. The only thing they see is that title, is the name of the service. But they don't go in and find out. They don't go in and talk to Dr. Hung about the services that are provided. And in the game they do, because it's a playful environment, and they go out and they explore their local services. We recreate local people. So this is an actual doctor who works at the Bunurong Aboriginal Health Services. And getting to know the doctor will allow players to not just know more about the services that are provided, but also create a connection with the people there, and allow the player to ask tricky questions about a tricky thing. So when we're talking about mental health, it's often difficult to ask the real questions, the things you actually want to know. And in the game, we always try and bring out those really interesting questions. This is another example of Streets of My Town in a different scenario. This is an actual youth worker. We worked with the Centre for Multicultural Youth in Australia, and they created a game to raise awareness about their programs for South Sudanese young people in the area. Then Big Bilik is a project that we're currently working on. It's actually called My Place, so how appropriate for this panel. Big Bilik is a project that we're running with Aboriginal people in Australia. And we got some funding actually to extend the stories that we're building in and extend those to different regions in Australia. And so I've got a quick video to show that as well. And so a player will download Big Bilik. These are all apps on the App Store. And they will put in their postcode. And so once that happens, we pull data from our server and make the game specific to that local area. It's also another example of how we can make Streets of My Town quite unique to the people that we work with and the organisation that we work with. And so the hope is that we'll have lots of different Aboriginal stories playing out in Streets of My Town. So that's Dr. Hong again. How do you get started? Well, we always get approached usually by a not-for-profit. I come from the not-for-profit world, and this is the very reason why I built this, is because it's usually very expensive and complicated to make games. And so my vision is to create a platform that small not-for-profits can start with really quickly and cheaply. And so you don't really need a big budget to get started, but you always need a longer term vision. So we don't see this as a one-off. We want Streets of My Town to really be a tool for that not-for-profit to tell their stories and tell the stories of the people that they live with. And you need buy-in from the community as well. And I think that's probably a common theme with place-based games, is that we can't make these games on our own. We need the community to collaborate with us. So that's a little bit about Streets of My Town. And again, if you're interested in finding out more or want to explore how that could look for the community that you live or work in, then by all means, get in touch, or after this session, we can chat further.
Cool. So, hello, I'm Hazel Arroyo. Applause, please. I'm Hazel Arroyo. I'm coming in today from Washington, D.C., so just a little bit closer than Australia. It was just a little easier to get here on the Amtrak. And today I'm here to talk to you about a 50-foot interactive sculpture along with a game engine that we are rolling out to over 25 libraries this year. So I'm part of a design collective based out of Washington, D.C., and we are focused on building outdoor games and on building games with this game engine that we've created called Hive Mechanic. We just received last year a $250,000 grant in order to roll out Hive Mechanic to reach out to libraries in over 25 cities. So I want to give a small shout out. Thank you so much to IMLS for believing in us. Yes, thank you.
Grants, yeah.
Yeah, grants.
Yeah.
And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of the first projects that we did using Hive Mechanic. And here we have Buoyant Oracle. So back in 2020, artist Sue Werbekan partnered with the Tefra Museum for Contemporary Art to install her 50-foot sculpture called Buoyant Force in Reston Town Center in Reston, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C. And as a part of this project, she reached out and partnered with the Playful City Lab as part of the AU Game Center, now it's called, to make this not just a sculpture, but an interactive experience. She wanted to tap into the surrealist ideals that a lot of her work is connected to, and so she reached out and we were able to collaborate to make this an interactive sculpture. So the interaction begins by scanning this QR code, which is affixed to the permanent signage that is there in Reston Town Center for the sculpture itself. And when you start texting with the sculpture, which is not something that happens every day, right? And so this first piece of the system is very conversational. You start off by texting the sculpture yourself. You get back a text message. You also get back some images that are meant to look like Polaroids that have been hand annotated. I don't know how many folks have done, your Polaroid, you take your picture and then you write underneath it, oh, like me and my sister are doing whatever. This was the general idea that we had going into this, to make it a much more personable sculpture, if you will, adding to that narrative piece. And so through this conversational side, not just with the text messages, but with these annotated images, it points to the history and the philosophy behind the sculpture itself and the work that went into that. But then beyond that, we have the oracle side of this. It's called Buoyant Oracle, right? So again, tapping into this surrealist ideals of Sue's work, somewhat hidden is an oracle. The oracle is comprised of some gift sets that are made up of original poetry along with visual images, and are sent to folks who decide to interact with the oracle. The original set of 5 potential readings was created by Sue, and then in the last year, we've added an additional 22 oracle readings, the content of which all came from women-identifying artists within the DMV, so the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, and was generously funded by the GLB Memorial Fund. So then beyond that, going a little bit into the design aspect of the project, we started this project in 2020, which I don't know if you guys knew, but there was a pandemic happening. So we had to really lean into the idea of social distancing when we came to figuring out how are we going to design this. On top of which the Tephra Gallery's physical space at the time of the launch was closed. And so we saw this as an opportunity to get some playful interaction for art goers who at the time were limited to just outdoor spaces, and figuring out how we might be able to connect with them in a more meaningful way. And again, going back to this idea of strengthening the idea of place. And so when we came to figuring out our system design, we leaned into a couple of important game design aspects, specifically offering choice. So we could have just as easily created this SMS system that just gives you a bunch of content dump and is kind of boring at the end of the day. But we really wanted to give choice. So there's branching to the narrative. And then because there's that branching, we also leaned into the idea of uncertainty. So you don't know exactly what someone is going to interact with because you've given them this choice. And then on top of that, we have the oracle side of the system, which gives you a randomly generated oracle reading. So two people will walk up to the system, and statistically, it's almost a certainty that they are not going to have the exact same experience. So we really wanted to lean into that in terms of the design aspect. When we look at the technical side of what we were working on, the actual tech that is required of participants is just a cell phone. We really wanted to make sure that there was a low barrier to entry, so we resisted the urge to just make an app for that. And also, you don't really need that robust of a data plan because it is all SMS and MMS based. And then going a little bit further into the technical side, I promised I was going to talk about this game engine. Hive Mechanic, it was designed by members of the Playful City Lab along with Chris Carr. And the engine itself is a server-based authoring tool, and it's specifically designed to create games and interactive stories for cities. We intentionally used an interface that furthers this metaphor of using cards and does not require any kind of coding knowledge in order to create games. We wanted to make sure it was as accessible as possible so that when we rolled this out into libraries, into communities, as many community members as possible would be able to create games for themselves and for their communities. And given that it's run by a server, it gives us a lot of affordances to play with our designs. So you can, manage multiplayer experiences with this. You can also use services like Twilio to do SMS, MMS, and phone calls. Any kind of open public APIs, we can ping off of those, and it gives you some really interesting design things you can do. Like you can ping off of Yelp's API, or you can check like what's the pollution in the air today, and that can be part of your game mechanic. And then also coordinating with things that are embedded in physical space. So we've done some experiments in the past in terms of embedding some Raspberry Pis in physical space and then being able to use Hive Mechanic to power and modify what's going on with our Raspberry Pis. And now a little plug. So as part of this grant, we just opened up our national call. So if you or anyone you know is interested in applying to be a library that can serve as a hub for making neighborhood and community games, you can scan the QR code. We also have the website up there. Also definitely happy to stick around and chat afterwards if you would like.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Matt Wilding from Revolutionary Spaces, and before I talk about my game, I do just want to mention that one of the reasons this game exists is actually because of Games for Change. I came to Games for Change for the first time almost, 5 or 6 years ago as a deep skeptic of games in education. I work in museums predominantly, and the work that I saw that folks like you were doing literally changed the trajectory of my career. And so I started focusing on game-based education in museums. So thank you for the work you all do. The game that I made is called Revolution is Brewing, and I made it with Gigantic Mechanic, which is a New York-based game firm that had built a platform called VoxPop. And we modded it a little bit to focus on the coercive acts, which is essentially the laws that were passed by the British Empire following the Boston Tea Party. The reason I did that, and you can see these not very good photos of the two sites that Revolutionary Spaces operates, because why wouldn't I talk about a place-based institution and show you good photos of that institution? The image that is on the right is of Old South Meeting House, and that's where the Boston Tea Party actually started. The final meeting on December 16th, 1773 was held in Old South because it was the largest building in Boston, and they ran out the side of it and turned left and threw all that tea into the harbor. And we wanted to create an opportunity for kids predominantly to come into that space and actually feel what that space was for, why it was preserved. That's why the building was preserved in the 19th century. It's one of the oldest private preservation projects in America. And you don't get that feel when you just visit the building. It just feels like an old church. We had a product called Tea is Brewing that had been running for some time that was pretty popular. And essentially what happened was kids were given these cards. And the card said, "I'm for the tea being unloaded because I'm a British tea officer and I like it." And then another card would say, "I'm for getting rid of the tea because I don't like taxes." And then the kids would read them, and then they'd all cheer huzzah and dump the tea. And then that was the end of the program. And that was super popular in 1973 when it was first offered. And it remained one of the most popular programs on the Freedom Trail in Boston in 2019. Because they just hadn't done much work in the way of innovating educational programming on the Freedom Trail. So when I arrived at Revolutionary Spaces in 2020, one of the core things I wanted to do was update that program. So we built a game called Revolution is Brewing, where we gave kids profiles in 4 specific buckets that we kind of generalized as moderate, British citizen, which means people who actually live in England, radical, and conservative, and we had them debate the issues and the response to the issues surrounding the coercive acts in 1774. And the goals of the game were to show complexity and nuance of the way people responded to the coercive acts, and how the struggles of the American Revolution persist through this day. These are aligned with the mission of Revolutionary Spaces. And this was really important to us because when we talk about the American Revolution, particularly to children, we tend to talk about it in a way that is kind of, frankly, not resonant with them. You know, like people are upset because there's a 1 penny tax on tea, but the tea is also subsidized, so it's cheaper, and people have this impression that maybe the British are trying to trick them into paying a tax so they can put other taxes on it. And that isn't the only reason people were upset about the things that were happening in America in the 1760s and 1770s. There were other positions at play, and not everyone was upset. Some people in America were actually very happy about the things that were happening in the American colonies. Most people in 1773, when the Boston Tea Party happened, in America actually believed that America was the freest place in the world, which doesn't jive with how we tend to teach American revolutionary history. And so we gave students this opportunity to talk about these issues from different perspectives. We also had to take into account that we had a very specific audience, which was Massachusetts high school teachers. Secondarily, of course, there are teachers across the country, but our primary audience is going to be people who can physically come to our space. So we had the Massachusetts teachers be our core audience. Now, the profiles that students are given look like this, and this one is a radical. And the radical bio here is kind of sarcastic. He says, "I'm horrified by the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor and totally didn't help organize it. I'm a gentleman no matter what the British papers say, and as an elected representative of the colonies, I'll do my best for the people, no matter whether the Crown approves or not." This, incidentally, is based on Samuel Adams, who most of us have heard of, right? But this game also has profiles from other people who are not necessarily as commonly represented. There is a black ship owner from New Bedford who is a character in the game. Most students don't realize that black people own property in 18th century America. He also, incidentally, is kind of a conservative in the game. He actually supports the British government's policies because the British government's policies allow him to own ships. There are enslaved people in the game because the perspective of enslaved people is not commonly put in the narrative of the fallout of the Boston Tea Party, but they actually are on record as having pretty strong opinions about it. And again, most notably, they're pretty loyalist, quote-unquote loyalist opinions in many cases, because slavery has been abolished in England proper, and there's a belief that the English are much more likely to end slavery in the colonies than the colonists are. So we give this variety of profiles to the kids, and then we have them negotiate the three very specific parts of the coercive acts in groups. Those issues essentially are whether or not the government of Massachusetts should be dissolved and we should bow down to Parliament, or whether or not the primacy of Massachusetts colonial government trumps that of the Parliament, whether or not we should pay for the tea so that the port can be reopened, or whether or not we should refuse to pay for the tea. And then ultimately, how we should respond in general. Should we have these arbitrary boycotts that were proposed that aren't really well organized, or whether or not we should have a Congress? And that's actually one of my favorite parts of this game, is that these kids are put in a position where they're told that the conservatives, again, in the game, are advocating for a Congress. Because that was the conservative position in 1774 was, well, we should talk about this rather than have these willy-nilly boycotts, because if we talk about this, maybe we can come to some kind of reasonable conclusion, and then the British government won't be angry at us anymore. Now, from a modern player perspective, we all know how that goes, right? I hope most of us know how that goes. But the Congress ends up meeting a couple of times. They raise an army, and then they declare independence. And they become, the American colonies become the first European colony to declare independence and succeed. But that wasn't an inevitable outcome in 1774. And so these students get to be in this space where these conversations actually happened. It can also be done in a classroom, but it should be done in Old South. And they get to take on these different points of view and negotiate the responses to all these policies in a different way, and hopefully try to persuade each other. Now, there is a video I want to show you of those kids doing that exact thing. And that's not that one. Sorry, I'm going to skip ahead. Here it is.
When you guys do stuff on your own, you destroy the tea. That could have been given to anyone. You just wanted it first. Yeah, but someone did.
Yeah. Now you're gonna pay taxes for it.
The tea now, the fish. It's destructive. It's treasonous.
All right. Well,
I disagree.
I was enslaved by the colonists, so having the colonists have a self-government is not a good thing because they can keep slavery around, and I don't want that.
Yeah.
They got it. I might have to make the switch. I am sorry. I might have to expect Parliament.
Damn, you switching it. All right, let's change it.
What changed your opinion? What changed your opinion? Tell me.
No.
What do you mean, just you?
Yourself? You try and get me on your side. Tell me what your thoughts are, huh?
So those kids got into a pretty heated debate about whether or not they should respect Parliament based on issues that were not necessarily in the forefront of public education when we just talk about this issue through textbooks. And I'll close with this very brief story. These kids played this game. Their teacher thought they were playing a different game, the old game, the 70s game. And they came here and they found out they were getting the new game and they were very upset about it. But the kids got so into it and the teacher was very happy about the kids getting so into it that she immediately booked for the next year, which is great. But then she messaged me a few days later, and she told me that they got so involved in arguing about the coercive acts later on in the day that they were asked to leave a Hard Rock Cafe. Which I don't have a lot of hard data about whether or not this stuff works, but I can't think of better circumstantial evidence to the power of games in places than that story. So please contact me or come meet a little bit later at the networking event, but I'd love to talk more about place-based games.
Great. So we're going to try to have a few conversations across the different projects, and I wanted to start with just the kinds of impact that we're seeing here. Clearly an educational product with some good, clearly some negatives for the Hard Rock Cafe, sure, potentially. But in terms of impacting a place, kind of at what scale do you set the place? You could almost say that your game was good for the country, so that maybe the place could be.
You could all get that down.
But I'm curious, what mechanisms do each of you see, and what's the for strengthening a place, and what's the place that you might point to? Anyone want to jump in?
For Streets of My Town, the connection to place is obviously very important. The seeing your own place in a game, especially for young people and children, it just blows their mind, right? And what Streets does, in Australia, you have a lot of new people who move to Australia, and you have these communities that are very, at times, individualistic. You know, people come to a place and they have their house and they're in a place, and to connect them to the services that are there and the people that are there, that can help them really get to know their place and create the connections, real life connections in a place is very powerful, I think. And so that's what we try to do and try and evaluate as well for every version.
Which, yeah, just to underscore that you can evaluate that, you can ask people how many places can you name, what's your kind of connection to those, which is, I think, some of our evaluation tools should be doing just that. That's great.
Exactly, yeah.
Others, thoughts?
Sure.
Place?
So, I mean, with Buoyant Oracle, it's in Reston, Virginia, so it has the same kind of issues in terms of defining community and defining places. I think a lot of suburbs do, at least here in the US, where it feels a little disconnected. You kind of need a car to get around, and people are very transient in the area simply because of the jobs that people typically have in the DMV area. A lot of folks are military, a lot of folks are working for government. They're in and out all the time, so it can be difficult to kind of feel that sense of community, feel that sense of place. And so when you have kind of seemingly out of the blue, out of nowhere, in the middle of the pandemic, you see, wow, this sculpture, it's huge, and it just came out of nowhere. What is that? And it creates a place of interest where people can congregate, but also where people can better define their space, better define, you know, what are the landmarks of my community? What are some ways that I can connect with others? And then I think on top of that, the project has this layer of gaining social capital through the additions of the 22 oracle readings that were done by women identifying artists that are all from the DMV, so it's all local artists as well. Sue's work is very, you know, again, rooted in this surrealist space, which historically and arguably still is a very male-dominated space. So it's a little bit about combining not just defining space, defining community, but also adding this level of social capital to it.
I kind of think of the game that we did as almost being symbiotic in its relationship with the place. So I used to be a tour guide, and I used to wear a colonial costume. I looked really good, and I always thought of the costume as kind of like a flag to get people to pay attention, and then they'd get on the tour, and hopefully I'd be good at the tour, and then they'd want to know more about the thing I was talking about, so they'd go do the thing, read more about the thing. I feel similarly about this. The site is famous. You know, the Old South Meeting House is an iconic building. The Old State House is an iconic building. They're the buildings you show on TV when the Patriots are playing about Boston, even though the Patriots aren't in Boston. And so people know that place, but they don't really know how to engage in it. So then they come to the place, they engage with this game, and then they're excited about the game, and in turn are excited about the place. So we need the place for the game, but we need the game to make more people in the future care about the place.
It's interesting. I think that well, in my opinion, when you try and create social impact, when you try and change something for the better, it always happens in place. You know, it very rarely just happens online. You know, you want to connect it to real life things because that's where the real power lives.
Yeah. For certain, I think there's a lot of research in the United States that some of the social mixing that is most powerful happens in places like public schools, where families that are different are forced to come into contact with each other at drop-off or at parent-teacher associations and things. Which brings me to the next question a little about some of the attention, that how do you get the attention of people to engage with your projects? It's not on an app store. Right? It doesn't seem like any of these would depend just on online ecosystems, especially not just game ecosystems or appealing just to gamers. So questions about how do you get that kind of attention in the place economy?
I think for me, and you know, if you're coming from a museum or historical site, this is actually a lot easier because you have teachers asking you constantly what you have, and to have something that is so different from a tour or a reenactment or something is huge. There's obviously some infrastructure that needs to be connected to that. You need a coordinator essentially. You need a staff to operate the game, but. I would actually encourage people who work in cultural institutions that people already want to interact with. This actually makes your job significantly easier because they're already coming.
Yeah, I think with us it's quite similar. It's this idea of like take the captive audience that you already have, meet them where they are, not try to bring them to a new place. So QR code with a text message, much easier to get in your captive audience than, oh, hey, we made this great app, go download it. Now, oh, you need your data plan. Oh, it's not connected to Wi-Fi. Okay, well, never mind. I've lost interest already. And again, just meeting folks where they are, I think is really important.
For Streets of My Town, the audience that we want to reach is usually very small. So it's very, very targeted. And the game is built by exactly that audience. So we bring in these lived stories. And so the group of people that are actually building the game in a collaboration with us, they become empowered to share their stories, and it's them who go out into their communities and share that story. So I think, for us, we don't look at big audiences. We don't want to reach global audience. We want to reach the right people at the right time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important implicit contrast, because a lot of the work at Games for Change presumes social change comes by reaching as big an audience as possible. Don't we want to have 10 million views? But for a lot of communities, if 10 million people showed up, it would be a total disaster, right? It would have to become a different community. On one hand, some businesses would thrive, but lots of people will get displaced. I mean, places are dealing with this kind of pressures right now, and they're not all a good thing. Meeting people where they all could also be in terms of the funding, though. So I'm curious about, does this open up new opportunities for funding? People have come to me and asked before, where are the game funders? I want to get my game funded. And in some way, I'm always like, well, I'm not sure that you want to necessarily just look at the game funders. Are there local funders that we're tying into? You mentioned one, Hazel, for your project.
Yeah, so I mean, we have the big IMLS grant, but I mean, the GLB Memorial Fund was this seed grant that Sue got, and it was specific to getting the content made for the game. So I think it's also about figuring out what pieces can be funded by what, depending on what kind of game you're making, or place-based activity as well. Yeah, I think that ties a little bit into that as well.
I think there's in museums, there's certainly a ton of opportunity for funding. I will say, and this is actually, I'll shout out to Gigantic Mechanic and Vox Pop again here. This is one of the reasons I ended up working with them, one of the many. And I think we see this repeated in all three of our projects. So you mentioned Hive Mechanic, you've created Streets of My Town, which is a thing that multiple different orgs or people can use that doesn't cost as much as creating code from scratch. If you go into museum spaces, for some reason, everyone wants to own the code. They want their own custom game code that is only for them and no one else can ever look at it again. And then they realize, oh no, that means I have to maintain this code. And then their system crashes within a year or two, and then it's over, right? But these module pieces of software that we can use make the price point a lot smaller, and then it makes it possible for nonprofit organizations to pay for them, because we can't pay $1 or $2 or $3 million. But if you go to an education funder or a grant or even a corporation that cares about education, and you're like, we need $75,000 or we need $150,000, that's super attainable, particularly with something flashy like this.
Yeah, these questions of kind of infrastructure at the local level repeat so many times because there are so many places that you could potentially reach. Democratizing the production seems implicit. You have tools that are about getting a lot of folks out there. Hazel, you mentioned one with a lot of libraries. So this question about how can we share the tools, does this come up naturally as with the audiences as they're playing? Do they ask, can we make things like this too? Or how does that pivot happen between playing something and making something?
There's always that question. People see the game and like, I want it too. I want to tell my story in streets of my town. So there's never a lack of people that want to use the platform. But it takes time and it's a complicated process, even though we reuse all the art and all the code. And every time we build a version, we create new things. And so that's the great thing about our project, is that the bank of art assets only gets bigger and bigger and bigger, which means that we can create better and better projects. It's about finding the right story, finding the organization that can fund it, and then scoping appropriately. So I think that's it doesn't have to be a big project. It can be a nice small story. And small stories, short stories, they're just cheaper, because they take less work to put into the platform. And then if you look at it as a longer term journey, not just this one-off, then that makes a lot of sense for not-for-profits as well, who usually have ongoing funding. And then you can just chip away at it one little bit at a time. So.
Any final words? I can't see the time, actually.
We have 3 minutes and 1 second.
Oh, excellent. There's our time.
I do just want to hop on that there's a belief that that we need something special, right? And we often look to programmers to create this thing that's special. But with these place-based institutions, we're the thing that's special. Mm-hmm. Like, so any system that we can put our content into is made alive by the content, not by the mechanic. The difference between Metroid and Castlevania, if you take all the graphics and words away, is not much, right? Mm-hmm. They're pretty much the same game, but we all pretty much agree that they're pretty different. Likewise, you put different information into that text message game, you can turn it into an adventure quest downtown or any variety of things. If you put different information into Streets of My Town, it could be a colonial town, it could be a modern town, it could be anything. Mm-hmm.
Maybe if we're looking ahead in our final minutes here to 5 years from now, we come back to Games for Change, and we ask, what do you hope to see? Would you want to see more projects like yours? Is there a radical hope that you want to put out there, or a fear? Is there a concern that we might do something wrong and lose some of the momentum around?
That's the fear, that we're wrong. We might all be wrong.
I think radical hope is, this expands further, and the process of making place-based games becomes a lot more democratized, and a lot more people out there go, I can totally do this. I can make something for my community, and it's coming from me. I think a fear that I personally have is that, very cynically, that it gets turned into something that's seen as, this is a way of selling things, and this is just a marketing ploy, and this is how I'm going to get this specific target demographic to go and buy this thing. I think that's a really cynical way of looking at the genre of games, and I hope it doesn't become that.
I think that my hope specifically, I work in history and civics games, is to create more synchronous or asynchronous games that are in different places that connect with each other, because that really is what most of American history is about, and certainly what American civics are about, is people from disparate backgrounds and disparate places coming to these kinds of, we often call them compromises, but often they're not compromises, they're agreements that somebody won a conversation, but these different outcomes that are based on the input of lots and lots of people. And as America expands and changes and ideally gets more democratic, more people get to be involved in those conversations. So if we can explore those conversations throughout history and include people that weren't necessarily involved in the conversation to better understand the outcome, I think that would be really exciting.
Anything else you wanted to add?
Well, look, I like to look at the hope. I don't really get into the fears so much. I don't really have any fears. I think, the fact that games get more accessible through a project like ours, I think is amazing, and more inclusive. If you can get more people, especially young people, to tell their stories by using games, I think the world will be a better place. So that's my hopeful thought.
All right. Stephen, Hazel, Matthew, thank you. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah.